Even though it has spiked upwards, it is still 30% below in real terms where it was in 1980. And it's something like 90% below where it was in 1900. So food has become more affordable. Now, you know, it was extraordinarily low a few years ago, to the point where land was coming out of production for food. And the things we can do, for example, you know, in Europe we have trade barriers against food from Africa. You know, a lot of cereals encounter tariff barriers if they try and export to Europe. Just getting rid of simple things like that would improve the productivity of the world. But then there's high-tech solutions coming down the pike behind that. Some of the GM technologies for dealing with drought and other things are going to increase the productivity of crops quite markedly. It's not going to be without its challenges. It's going to be hard work, but so long as we innovate, I see no reason why we can't get to a point where we're feeding 9 billion people in 2050 at a better level and with far less hunger than we do today.
Yeah, I noticed there, Gordon, you wanted to come in there. I mean, but do you see it as much of a optimistic side looking back at the figures, or do you feel that rather than talking, as you did there, Matt, about challenges, that it's a more awesome word today and should be crises or something like that?
Well, I'm also an optimist because I've seen what's happened, but I think optimism is a genetic trait and I just happen to have got it. You know? Yeah. But I think the problem is, as Matt says, you can feed the 9 billion, but it's not just feeding the 9 billion. They're increasing their consumption of livestock. You've got to produce much more grain because of the livestock they're eating. The prices of fertilizers are going up. There's shortages of water and shortages of land, and we've got climate change on top of that. So it's not just as simple as feeding an extra 2 billion people. There's an enormous number of other things that have got to be tackled, and that's partly due to the technologies that Matt's talking about, but it's also due to getting both the governments and the private sector to work much better together than they are now. That's where I get pessimistic, is about getting governments and private sector to really work on this.
To really work together. Do you get pessimistic about things like that?
I get pessimistic until I talk to poor people, and then usually you come away feeling much more excited about the possibilities.
Yeah.
But I think there's another problem here, which is these kind of purely technological solutions ignore the fact that there's enough food in the world today and 1 billion people are going hungry. The system is producing 1 billion hungry people and 1 billion overweight and obese people. The system is not actually working. So we do have to look at the system itself, not just at technological solutions, and say, how do we actually increase the voice, the power of people at the bottom to get their fair share, to organise so they get decent prices for their crops, to actually change the system so that people are getting a decent slice of the action, because at the moment it really isn't happening and technology won't solve that. Obesity
there you're mentioning, does that just have a sort of the obvious effect of people consuming more food, but is it more of a problem than that?
Oh, definitely. In a number of developing countries, you've now got an obesity problem, diabetes, heart problems, living alongside a hunger problem. So even within a country like Mexico or South Africa, you actually have a kind of dual world which we aren't used to because of a food system which is not actually delivering good nutrition to people at either end of the spectrum.
Yes, Carl, coming to you at that point, have you seen the thing broadly and widely, as Duncan was saying there, the problem in South Africa or other countries around the world? Have you had a chance in your travels to see the problems in action?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's interesting you talk about obesity and hunger. In America, there's been an explosion of obesity, especially in children, which means diabetes, which brings other problems and other health issues right alongside of the hunger issue. And a lot of that is simply because of the focus is on how do we make the most money and not how do we feed the most people in a healthy way.
Thank you. Absolutely. So what are the urgent things that need to be done, Gordon?
Well,
urgent.
We need to make sure that the best practices are taken up around the world. We do need more research. We need more research on how to solve problems. But in particular, we need to work to connect small farmers to markets, both input markets, so they can get seed and fertilizer, and output markets so they can sell their crops. If they have the links to those two kinds of markets, they can do it. We know that. African farmers can produce a lot of food. It's been demonstrated over and over again. But unless they've got the links to those markets, it won't happen.
I would add to that two things. One is, this is not a separate issue from climate change. I mean, climate change is going to be, unless we solve climate change, solving the food problem is going to be 10 times harder. And when you're talking about farmers, think about women farmers, because the easiest way to increase production is to give women equal access to seeds, credit, all the things that farmers need. To give women farmers that access immediately gives you a big hit on production and increases social fairness.
What do you think is most urgent?
Well, I think the most urgent thing in the short term is to get the price of food down again, because as Carl and Gordon have said, you know, people are really hurting because of the price of food. And how do you do that? You dismantle the trade barriers so that Africans can sell their produce in Europe. You stop the biofuel programs so that food doesn't go into fuel instead, and you solve these infrastructure problems, as Gordon said. You know, between so these are very low-tech things. I mean, some huge percentage of food, particularly in continents like Africa, gets wasted between the field and the plate, as it were. But it's just worth, I think, reflecting. We've been talking about obesity, and it's an issue. But if we sat here in the mid-1960s when we thought it wasn't worth trying to save the starving people in India, a lot of people said that because you can't do it. It can't be done. There was genuine counsel of despair about all these extraordinary famines that were happening in India. We've got to grasp the nettle and realise that not everybody's going to be able to live. Unbelievable the way people were talking then. And yet now India is not only feeding itself handsomely, it's also exporting to the rest of the world. Africa can do the same if we get these basic things right, and if we allow new technology to come along.
Africa can really do the same, as India has done.
Africa could be a food exporting continent. I think there's no question about it. And climate change, yes, it may have bad effects, but actually what's been happening in the last 30 years, remember how the Sahel was drying out in the 1970s? If you look at the Sahel now, it is greener than it was then. Rainfall has increased in that area. Carbon dioxide alone increases the yields of crops, actually. If we double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the yield of wheat, rice and soybeans is going to go up by about 30%, other things being equal. Now, other things won't be equal because we've got to get the irrigation and fertilizer, etc., to those crops. But that's, there are pluses as well as minuses in the things that are happening to the climate.
I just want to add, and that is why there's more reason why we should have coordination like we're hearing. Because with climate change, we're going to have where some areas become greener and some areas become drier. So we're going to have that coordination, because areas that are right now that have great, that are great for growing crops are going to be maybe poor in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. So we're going to have to make sure that we come together and work to try to solve a world problem and not just a regional problem.
Right.
That's right. In the old days, you could get starvation in one area because crops had failed, and because there wasn't enough trade, actually the only thing people could do was get on their feet and move out of that area. And in Europe in the Middle Ages, you got these famines in quite small localized areas, and it was cheaper to move people than it was to move food. Nowadays, if Australia fails or Russia fails, as we had bad harvests in Australia and Russia this year, okay, the price goes up. But food does move around the world, and so it's not quite the same local crisis as it would have been in the old days.
But if you're a Bangladeshi who spends 80% of your income on food, and food prices go up, it doesn't really matter whether trade is functioning or not. You can't actually afford to feed your family. So the pure trade argument ignores the question of incomes of poor people on the ground, and that's what's actually causing some of the suffering now with the food riot, which is resulting in the food riots.
But I just want to come back to climate change, if I might.
You certainly may.
I'm much more concerned about it than Matt is. 2010 was the hottest year on record for the globe, as high as it was in 2005. And wherever you go, for example, in Africa, you can see the effects of climate change. If you go into a village and you talk to the villagers and you say to them, is climate change happening? They say, yes, of course it is. And you ask them what's happening, they'll tell you, and you say to them, are you trying to adapt to it? And they say, yes, we're trying to do this and we're trying to do that. It's true, as Matt says, that in some parts of the world, the carbon dioxide will increase yields, but for most of Africa, it's going to be devastating. And that's going to be true not just of Africa, but of Asia and of China. And those governments have woken up to this. The Chinese in particular, they're really concerned about climate change because they can see the effects now of all these extreme events. The things we've had this year or last year, the Pakistan floods, the Russian drought, and the years before in Australia, the big droughts there and the floods now, you can't prove they're a result of climate change. but they're the kind of things that all the climate change models say are going to happen increasingly in the future.
Carl, from what you were saying earlier on, this link in the crisis between the climate change and with what we've been talking about food, there is a real relationship between the two. Do you feel that?
Oh, no question. Yeah, absolutely. And what I think people are underestimating is something that was mentioned earlier is water. I've lived in Los Angeles and I've lived in places, and water is such a huge issue because getting fresh, clean water, not